Hello, and welcome to today's Ethical Dilemma in Science, where we're going to take a look at guilt through association, catching a serial killer. Now, this talk is loosely based on the original Night Stalker, Golden State Killer, Vinsalia ransacker. It's basically a series of murders, rapes, and burglaries that occurred in the 1970s and 1980s out in California. It's been all of the the crimes have been associated with a single individual now, and it's being referred to as the Golden State Killer case. Now, when you have a crime that occurs, there is often an attempt to try to figure out who is the perpetrator, who it is that committed that crime. And so forensic science is an area of science that goes through and analyzes evidence from crime scenes in an effort to identify who is responsible. So things that they can look at are things like blood evidence to try to do blood typing, blood type of an individual, A, B, O, even before the ability to study DNA. They may look at the patterns of knots that were used to tie up victims. Sometimes elaborate knots have a pattern that can be used to identify. This example here, we were looking at a shoe print. They can take casts of the shoe and get an idea about the size of the shoe, which indicate the height. The step length would indicate the individual's height of the individual. The weight based on the depth that goes into the soil. And then they can also look at fingerprints. But in this case, the Golden State Killer case, the perpetrator wore gloves. Now I'm going to look a little bit further and present a little bit more about fingerprint analysis because that's going to lead into what we're going to look at with DNA analysis. Now fingerprint analysis has been used for almost 100 years, and so since the 1920s. And the idea is that your pattern of fingerprints is going to vary from individual to individual, and on your fingertips are going to be a series of loops and whorls and arches, basically a pattern that they can go through, and like they're highlighting here, little gaps that are present, or little whorls or loops and triangles and things like that. They can be used to identify an individual, and so much so that the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, has an automated fingerprint identification system called AFIS, in which law enforcement officials can load in a fingerprint, load in the pattern, and see if it can be identified. Now, with DNA analysis, we're basically going to be looking at patterns again. In the human DNA, it's about 99.5% identical from one individual to the next. But there are going to be relatively small differences in that remaining percentage, half a percentage, that makes each person's DNA unique. And so because of that, we can go through and look at the pattern similar to the way in which we would look at fingerprints. And so examples of this would be like a paternity test right here. We take a look at this and we've got DNA test results, essentially a pattern, child in one column, mother in one column, possible father one, possible father two. And you basically, like you're looking at fingerprints, trying to figure out what patterns match up. Now, if we think about, a child in a paternity case, they're going to have certain characteristics and traits from the mother, and they're going to have certain characteristics and traits from the father. And that's going to be coming from the DNA. The DNA from the mother is going to code for or provide information for some of the characteristics, and the DNA from the father is going to provide information for other characteristics. And so half the information is going to come from the mother, and half the information is going to come from the father. And so if this child then has this pattern of DNA, part of that pattern is going to be coming from the mother, and part of it is going to be coming from the father. And so if we take a look at the results, we can see that in this case, this pattern here and that pattern there, it's called a band, but that matches up between the child and the mother. And so that indicates that this pattern or this band on the child came from the mother. And so we got to look at this remaining band. And we say, okay, of the two possible fathers, which one matches up? This individual here has two bands, again, one from their mother, one from their father, but it's not matching up with what's present in the child. However, this one, possible father number two, has a pattern that matches up exactly. And so this is like fingerprints, but allows us to say, okay, this is most likely the father of this child. Now, when we take a look at DNA, it becomes a lot more complicated than that simple example I've got there. And so the DNA has been looked at by the FBI for about 30 years, since about 1990. And it's now been expanded within the last 10 years, in that they've got this huge database of genetic information, again, those patterns, those bands, almost like DNA fingerprints, that are present within this automated system in which they can go through and compare the pattern, like they compare the pattern of a fingerprint against the pattern in the DNA. And today, over 190 public law enforcement organizations are participating in this database, as well as internationally, over 50 countries are using the same type of system for identifying individuals. So far, in the 30 years that this has been used, it's been used in a little over 500,000 cases, 500,000 investigations. Now, the source of this DNA, we take a look at it. For federal crimes and a number of states, they will collect DNA when a suspect is arrested for a crime, and then use that to try to identify the individual, put it into the database, and see if they get matches. Other states still require a search warrant in order to be able to get the DNA and be able to put it into their database. Now, if we take a look at, I did want to say one other thing, but I don't. We'll say it later. So there's been limited use of the FBI database because there's only a limited amount of information in it because of the ability to collect this data. If we take a look at home DNA tests, what we can see is that the market, basically the number of DNA tests that have been sold, have doubled every year for the last 4 years. And so we've got the National DNA Index has about 14.5 million profiles within it. Ancestry DNA, the largest consumer DNA database, as of early 2021, had 18 million. 23andMe, another large provider, had another 12 million. And so we can see that these private databases already surpass the national FBI database. And so the question then becomes, should we use these larger databases to try to investigate and identify perpetrators of crimes? Now, in the Golden State Killer example, they got written permission to conduct what they called a genealogy investigation, where they basically took some of the DNA from the crime scene, 30, 40 years ago, ran it through that process, and tried to come up with a match. And what they came up with was basically an individual over here, which was identified as being a distant relative of the perpetrator of the crime. But based on that, they were able to, recognize that, it is a, somewhat distant relative, but probably in the range. They were able to take a look at the family tree, look at the location where these individuals were living at the period of time, their current age, other characteristics, and then they also started to track down DNA from other relatives within this genetic tree, and ultimately identified the suspect in this case. And at that point, they obtained a DNA sample from the suspect from a discarded tissue in his garbage. Now, with the DNA technology that we have available now, we can identify approximately 60% of the white Americans within the United States. And this is the case of Joseph DeAngelo, the suspected Golden State Killer. At his court date, he has since been, he's pled to these crimes and has been sentenced. And so if we take a look at the ethical dilemmas associated with it, should we, provide investigators access to the information in these private commercial databases? There are a lot of concerns about the quality assurance standards. There are very stringent guidelines for the forensic scientists that take samples, that take the forensic evidence, and they actually have to undergo regular training and certification to be able to have the chain of evidence that's necessary for court cases. The DNA database terms of service Originally, they said that it may be required to release some personal information in response to lawful requests by public authorities. But they didn't expect this type of usage. And so now many of these databases have adjusted their terms of service to warn them that law enforcement may have access to their database on some circumstances. Now, some of the databases, some of these providers have fought against the access. Others have said that they will deny access if the subscriber has opted out. But the question is, should they have to opt in a situation like that? And in response to some of the concerns that have raised out of the Golden State Killer case, the U.S. Department of Justice in 2019 placed interim restrictions on the use of these databases until they can work out some of these issues. There are other issues that are related to it as well. We've got the Fourth Amendment that says basically an individual should not be put upon for unreasonable search and seizure. And so the question then becomes, should investigators have to prove probable cause in order to get a DNA sample for analysis? Does collecting DNA samples from a person arrested of a crime violate their Fourth Amendment rights? Because their DNA, is basically part of them and is, in essence, being taken, is being kind of seized in this process. And then finally, if the person is acquitted of the crime, should their DNA record be expunged? Because it was collected when they were arrested. They were shown to be not guilty, or at least acquitted. Should it be should it be expunged? Should it be removed from the database? Now, if we take a look at D'Angelo, the Golden State Killer, he was arrested in 1979 for shoplifting dog repellent and a hammer. If DNA was collected for a misdemeanor, he could have been identified kind of halfway through his crime spree. In terms of the Fifth Amendment, it says that an individual will not be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against themselves. Is the use of a person's DNA against themselves a violation of the intent of the Fifth Amendment? Should the use of current DNA analysis be used to confirm or exonerate people convicted in crimes before the DNA era? We can go through and learn a lot more if we go back and go through those. And then another example, who controls the data? Is it ethical for these private databases to change their terms of service to limit access to law enforcement investigators to protect criminals? Does it matter if the crime involves harm to a person or harm to property, or if it's used to identify information, to identify a lost child or unknown remains? Does a person that opts into participation in a database give up the rights of those close relatives? In the Golden State Killer case, we're taking a look at a close relative basically helped identify the killer. And then finally, if the goals of the criminal justice system is rehabilitation, should a 75-year-old person be incarcerated for crimes committed over 30 years ago when, at least at the outset, it appears as if he hasn't committed crimes in the intervening years? And so that's our introduction to DNA technology and DNA sequencing and mapping. So as always, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me by email. Thank you and have a great day.